Edmund Husserl, born on April 8th, 1859 in Proskyov, Moravia, what is today the Czech Republic. He would go on to create a new method of philosophy that sought to make it an exact science, the science of appearance or phenomena, phenomenology. While the particular method of Husserl's phenomenology was new and unique, many of the core concepts of Husserl's philosophy are already found abundantly in the history of philosophy. He and other early phenomenologists found components of phenomenology in Descartes, Kant, Leibniz, even Plato and Aristotle. Studying immediate experience, attempting to look at the facts of being alive outside of our inherited biases. In some sense, philosophy just is the effort to look at reality with fresh eyes, to set aside our limited understanding and go deeper. While there is something like a universal human tendency, therefore, towards phenomenological insight, Husserl is indeed doing something new that is possible in virtue of this universal tendency. What he did was to create a framework for a new intersubjective knowledge production based on this. That is what science is for Husserl. Science is a intersubjective knowledge production. More than anything else, science is a way of collectively producing understanding. It is a way of communicating some particular view that is acquired from experience with the help of our intelligence and our imagination. We seek to communicate with each other a way of making sense of things, a way of articulating the coherence and organization that we find among phenomena. Phenomenology is a study, right? Logi, of phenomena, but in ancient Greek meant something very concrete. It is the effort to articulate, the act of speaking and gathering and putting together, getting at the internal coherence rather than a logic that is applied externally and is totally general and unrelated to that which it is applied to. Phenomenology is as a way of communicating the interconnections and variety of modes of coherence that we find in consciousness, experience, and our lived embodiment. It is the world and our intersubjective life that first and most continuously gives coherence to our experience. Phenomenology is not just interested in consciousness and subjectivity, but is interested in the meaning of the world and our relation to others as it is appearing in consciousness and as it structures our consciousness. Husserl opens a whole new set of ideas that humans had never dreamed of, an infinite field of investigation that is not merely a new object of thought, a new content of thought, a new area for research, but rather a new way of thinking, a radical modification of us as thinkers. We become phenomenologists, we change the way we think, and this changes thinking as such. Most of all, the way that we make sense of our life in relation to others. Thinking together in an intersubjective community of understanding, of knowledge production. Husserl is almost obsessed with this idea of science, of creating a science of consciousness. He studied astronomy in 1986, and he attended lectures on mathematics, physics, and philosophy, especially Wilhelm Wundt lectures on philosophy, and Wundt was a pioneering experimental psychologist. So Husserl's early studies are in mathematics and physics and philosophy, and his doctoral thesis is on the logical structure of thinking in relation to mathematical knowledge, and in particular arithmetic. But already in this time, he is concerned with the patterns of thought, the way that consciousness shapes itself when it entertains mathematical ideas and objects. He then goes on to address that idea directly in his next major work called The Logical Investigations. They're an investigation into, you could say, the intellectual mind at work. It is a phenomenology of the intellectual mind. And after The Logical Investigations, he had already tapped into phenomenology, had started doing something phenomenological, but he hadn't really clarified what that is and what it means and how it's unique and how to do it and what it can give us if we do it. So his book, Ideas 1, Ideas for Pure Phenomenology and a Phenomenological Philosophy, General Introduction to Pure Phenomenology, is an attempt to clearly delineate what the method of phenomenology is, what it can achieve, and how it goes about doing that. A phenomenological question looks something like this. Why and how does some given mode of coherence show up in our experience? And then, what are the conditions of its emergence and evolution? This is a question, therefore, of transcendental philosophy because it investigates the patterns that we do not notice while experiencing the content of our everyday conscious phenomena, what can be present to consciousness typically. So transcendental philosophy is not looking at what is contained in a representation, but what structures our experiences. The transcendental structure of experiences are not given in experience, but are the way that experience has coherence and structure. It's what structures and gives coherence to what is given in the representation, or what we are conscious of. In a sense, it is the way we align ourselves to something, the way we meet it on its terms. It's a way of being open to the appearance. In a way, we open ourselves to number being meaningful, and then things being numbered appears to us because of our openness to that way of interpreting. So we're not creating number, we're not generating number in our mind as a kind of illusion or fantasy or anything like that, but we're opening ourselves to number as such. And here this probably sounds kind of Platonist, because it is, but that there are forms that are numbers and we are not creating them, but we are opening to them, and therefore quantity and number appear relevant to us and thinkable. Strict geometric space is like this as well. We adopt a certain attitude and appearances become relevant within the consideration of geometrical space. We do not immediately perceive geometrical space, but we think it, and we think it by adapting or adopting a certain attitude. A mathematical insight, it seems, is always elicited through an appearance of coherence. But we always have to prepare ourselves to receive this coherence by tuning into the type of coherence that it affords. We find the structure and the coherence of numbers in themselves. We examine the numbers and we find within them their logic. This is one of the early ideas that Husserl pushes against people that he calls psychologism. Psychologism says that it's because of our psychological determination, the determinism of our psychological state, that numbers are thinkable in the way that they're thinkable. The coherence of the idea of a triangle, however we conceive it, however we imagine it, however we approach it in thought, has its root in the essence of the triangle itself, rather than in our mental picture. Or the coherence of the world also seems to have some degree of transcendence in this sense, as Husserl would say, by which he means a distance and separation from my sphere of immanence. What he means by that is the continuity of my psychical conscious experience. The coherence of the world is not entirely dependent on the activity of my consciousness, and the coherence of numbers is also not dependent on my consciousness. If I look at an ordinary object, I can quickly identify it as a book. But if I suspend this act of recognition and look at the mode of appearing, what I find is that I have a series of profiles. This is a term Husserl uses all the time. A profile is a kind of unique perspective on the surface of the book from a certain angle, and I can move around, and I have a multiplicity of perspectives, a multiplicity of profiles, and they are modified by me turning and opening it and moving around it. What I adhere to in the coherence that is not, given in a single presentation, a single instance of perception, but rather across this plurality of profiles, is the transcendent unity of the object as its own object, not constituted by my consciousness. Husserl came to refer to the underlying condition of this appearance as transition synthesis or passive synthesis. This is seen by many later phenomenologists, from his student Martin Heidegger to French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty, as one of Husserl's greatest contributions, the central importance of our experience of time, of the temporality of our consciousness. He began exploring this in Ideas 1 near the end, but then went on to expand greatly on his phenomenology of time in his lectures that he turned into a book called The Phenomenology of Internal Time Consciousness. So where Kant's transcendental philosophy focused entirely on logic, and a very simplistic logic from Husserl's perspective, because logic had evolved greatly to the time of Husserl from Kant, but where Kant remains entirely cognitive, right, by which I mean in looking at the inner appearances of our judgments of science and of logic. Husserl is interested in experience in a much broader sense, and the temporality of our consciousness as it evolves in various experiences. Husserl's phenomenology as a science of eidos, a science of essences, seeks to understand the essence of consciousness, the way that consciousness always works and has to work. Where empirical psychology is a science of facts, phenomenology is a science of essences. He says natural knowledge starts with experience and remains in experience. In the theoretical attitude that we call the natural attitude, the entire horizon of possible lines of research is accordingly designated by one word: the world. Thus, the sciences of this original attitude are, one and all, sciences of the world. And as long as this attitude dominates to the exclusion of others, the following concepts coincide: true being and actual being, i.e., real being, and since everything real merges into the unity of the world, the being of the world. To each science, there corresponds a region of objects as the domain of the science's research, and to all the knowledge gained in them, intuitions in which objects of the region are themselves given and are given, at least partially, in an originary way. The intuition that affords them and that belongs to the first natural sphere of knowledge and all its sciences is natural experience. And the experience that affords the object in an originary way is perception, understood in the usual sense of the term. To have something real given in an originary way, to become aware of it by way of simply intuiting and to perceive it are one and the same thing. We have experience in the originary sense of physical things in our outer perception, but no longer in memory or anticipation, expectation. We have experience in the originary sense of ourselves and the states of our consciousness in so-called inner or self-perception, but we do not have it of others and their experiences in empathy. We observe others' experiences on the basis of perceiving their bodily expressions and exertions. We are conscious of the others and the life of his soul as itself there, and there in a way that is one with his body, but we are not conscious of this as given in an originary way. The world is the sum total of objects of possible experience and experiential knowledge, of objects that can be known in correct theoretical thinking on the basis of actually present experiences. Science of the world, that is to say, sciences belonging to the natural attitude, are so-called sciences of nature in the narrow and the broader sense, i.e., sciences of material nature, but also those of animal essences with their psychological nature, thus also physiology, psychology, and so forth. Also belonging here are all so-called humanities or sciences of human spirit, i.e., history, science of culture, sociological disciplines of every kind, whereby we can provisionally leave it open whether they are to be equated with the science of nature or set in opposition to them, whether they themselves should count as sciences of nature or as an essentially new type of science. Husserl here establishes an understanding of an originary perception, or what he calls a ordinary perception given in an originary way, such that it affords, that it gives, that we receive, that we intuit. And in all of these senses, we are certain. We do not question. We are completely convinced. And now, of course, this originary givenness of, content in our experience, of coherence and continuity from one moment to another in our consciousness. This could be perceiving, this could be thinking, this could be dreaming. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that we are experiencing and that we are aware of our experience in perceiving and thinking or dreaming. The natural attitude takes the existence of our content, takes the existence of this coherence that we find in our experience, which is called the world. It takes this as the true and actual being, and it studies it in that way, under that assumption, and in relation to the natural attitude. It's a way in which we configure our consciousness, and again, a way in which we open it to receive and to be given and to let things show up as relevant from a certain perspective. That's what an attitude does. And the natural attitude says, I'm ready for something to come through my perception or my senses that is meaningful and important and on which I will act and on which I will conduct myself. The natural attitude is this way of treating our experience and life that is sort of demanded by the needs of life. In life we have to eat and we have to take care of ourselves and we have to avoid dangers and we have to, therefore, keep our attention fixed on interworldly beings and understanding how to navigate them and make sense of them. And this attitude lends itself to natural science, and therefore the natural attitude and natural science are part and parcel of the same attitude. And when we begin instead to reflect phenomenologically, to adopt a phenomenological attitude, we no longer are interested in facts, but are now interested in essences. These essences are inseparable from facts. They are part of our psycho-conscious makeup, and it's our psycho-conscious makeup that makes certain facts available to us. but they are not facts, and they cannot be understood through facts, and therefore they cannot be understood through natural science and the natural attitude. But the natural attitude and natural science can be understood through our phenomenology of essences. Here's what he says in section 2, fact and the inseparability of fact and essence. Sciences of experience are sciences of facts. Experiencing's founding acts of knowledge posit something real individually. They posit it as existing spatio-temporally, as something that is at this point in time, something that has its duration and a real content that, in accordance with its essence, could have just as well been at any other point in time. So too, these acts of knowledge posit it in turn as something that is in this place with this physical shape, yet where the same reality, considered in terms of its essence, could just as well have been at any arbitrary place with any arbitrary shape, and could alter itself in this way while it remained factually unchanged, or could alter itself in another way than the way it is in fact alters itself. Individual being of every kind is contingent. It is a certain way. It could, in keeping with its essence, be otherwise. Determinate laws of nature may also be valid, by virtue of which, if there are in such and such real circumstances, then there must in fact be such and such determinate consequences. Still, such laws express only factual regularities that could themselves be completely otherwise, and that already presuppose a part of the essence of objects of possible experience from the outset. That similar objects governed by those regularities are considered in themselves contingent. But the sense of this contingency that is called here matter of factness is constrained by virtue of being correlated with a necessity that does not refer to the mere factual obtaining of a rule governing the coordination of spatio-temporal facts, but instead has its character of the necessity of an essence, and is thus related to the universality of an essence. When we said that each fact, in keeping with its own essence, could be otherwise, it just is part of the sense of everything contingent to have an essence, and thus an eidos that is to be grasped purely, and this eidos stands then under truths of essence at various levels of universality. The individual object is not merely, in general, an individual one, this here, a once and only object. Fashioned as such and such in its very self, it has its own kind of being, its complement of essential predicates that must pertain to it, as the entity as it is in itself, so that other secondary relative determinations can pertain to it. Thus, for example, every tone in and for itself has an essence, and at the highest level, the universal essence of tone in general, or rather, the acoustical in general, understood purely as an inherent aspect to be drawn intuitively from the individual tone, individuality, or through comparison with others as common to them. So too, each individual material thing has its own essential kind of being, and at the highest level, it has the universal kind of being of a material thing in general, together with a determination of time in general, duration in general, figure in general, materiality in general. Another individual can also have everything inherent to the essence of the individual, and at the highest essential universality of this kind, as the example we have just given suggests, circumscribes regions or categories of individuals. Husserl's descriptions here rely on the fact that when we experience and make sense of the natural world as a science of facts, we will always have some eidetic structure which allows all of the parts to hang together and make sense. We will talk in physiology about the body of the animal, and we'll talk in mineralogy of the body of the rock. And in both cases, we have an idea of body. And we might have subcategories of body, different ways body shows up, but we have an idea of body that holds them together on a high level of generality. And here the essences are inseparable from the facts. They are part of the matter of facts, and the logic of them is constrained to be the correlate of these obtaining facts. They're governed by the spatiotemporal facts. And then in section 3, he goes on to further describe what he means by essence. So let's take a look at that. Section 3, discernment of essence and individual intuition. Essence initially designated what is to be found in the being that is proper to the individual itself as its what. Each such what, however, can be put into the form of an idea. Experiential or individual intuition can be transformed into an instance of seeing the essence, ideation, a possibility that is itself to be understood not as empirical, but as an essential possibility. The discernment that affords the essence, perhaps affording it in an originary way, can be an adequate discernment, such as we can readily obtain in the case of the essence of tone, for example. However, it can also be a more or less incomplete or inadequate discernment, and not only in regard to greater and lesser clarity and distinctness. In certain cases, for a specific kind of category of essence, the essence can inherently be given only one-sidedly. They can be given in succession in a many-sided way, but never from all sides. Correlatively, for this reason, the individual instances corresponding to them can only be experienced and presented in inadequate, one-sided empirical intuitions. That holds for every essence related to something with the makeup of a thing, and to be sure, in keeping with all the components of the essence of extension or materiality. Indeed, if we look at it more closely, subsequent analysis will make this evident. It holds for all realities generally, whereby, of course, the vague expressions, one-sidedness and many-sidedness, will take on definite meanings, and various kinds of inadequacy will be separated from one another. For the moment, it suffices to point out that the very spatial shape of the physical thing is in principle something that can only be given in mere one-sided profiles, and that regardless of this inadequacy that persists relentlessly, and in spite of any gain in any succession of continuous intuitions, each physical property also draws us into infinities of experience, that each experiential manifold, however so widely extended, leaves open even more detailed and new determinations of the thing, and so on, ad infinitum. Whatever kind of intuition the intuition of an individual is, whether adequate or not, it can take the turn to seeing the essence, and this seeing, whether it is a corresponding manner, adequate or not, has the character of an affording act. This entails, however, the following. The essence, eidos, is an object of a new kind, just as the given in the individual or experiential intuition is an individual object, so the given in the intuition of the essence is a pure essence. There is not merely an external analogy, but instead a radical commonality here. The discernment of the essence is also precisely an intuition, just as an eidetic object is precisely an object. The generalization of the concepts intuition and object, such that they belong correlatively together, is not an arbitrary fancy, but instead demands in a quite compelling way by the nature of the matters. The experience brings it to givenness. As perception, it brings the object to the originary givenness, to consciousness, so as to apprehend the object in an originary way, and it is in itself in person, or as it is bodily present. But what is then also presented in other acts, whether thought vaguely or distinctly, can be made the subject of true and false predications, just like any object in the necessarily broad sense of formal logic. Every possible object, or to put it logically, any subject of possible true predication, has precisely its ways, prior to all predicative thinking, of coming into view, a view that presents it, intuits it, at times even encountering it as it is itself in person, apprehending it. Thus, the discernment of an essence is an intuition, and if it is discernment in the exact sense, and not a mere, then it is an intuiting that affords the essence in an originary way, apprehending it in its selfhood in person. At the same time, however, it is a kind of intuition that is intrinsically unique and novel, in contrast to the kinds of intuition that pertain correlatively to the object of other categories, and in contrast in particular to intuition in the usual narrow sense, i.e., the intuition of something individual. It is certainly part of the distinctiveness of the intuition of an essence that a chief element of individual intuition, namely the appearance or visibility of something individual, underlies the intuition of the essence. Although it does so, to be sure, neither as an apprehension of what is individual, nor by any means as a positing of the individual as an actuality. What is certain is that at a certain consequence of this, one cannot have an intuition of an essence without being able to shift one's focus freely towards a corresponding individual and form a consciousness, just as, conversely, one cannot have an intuition of something individual without freely being able to form an idea of it and to focus within the idea on the corresponding essence that is exemplified in what is individually visible. But that changes nothing in the following regard, namely that both kinds of intuiting are intrinsically different, and in the sentences of the kind we have just articulated, notice is only taken of their essential relations. The essential relations between existence, obviously here in the sense of something that exists individually, and essence, between fact and eidos, corresponds to the essential differences between intuitions. Pursuing such connections, we apprehend in a patently discernible way the conceptual essences belonging to these terms and firmly coordinated with them from now on. By this means, any partway mystical thought attaching itself especially to the concept eidos, idea, and essence is cleanly eliminated. Okay, there's a lot there, but what Husserl is saying is that we can change our attitude, and this will afford a new type of object, and this object will be an essence rather than a fact. Consciousness holds within itself this possibility of modulating from the apprehension of a science of facts and of facts through the natural attitude to a eidetic view, a view of the eidos, a view of the transcendent structure, of the implicit coherence by which we understand and think. Any individual thing that we perceive or intend, anything that is an object of our conscious experience, can be modified. It affords us a possibility of modifying its appearance to show up as essence, as a multifaceted object that can be understood through a plurality of ways. It is what the object is, its whatness is essentially multiplicity. It is essentially something that affords a plurality of approaches. It is many-sided. Even a perceived thing we can think of as a material object. We can think of it as a visible image. We can think about it as a memory, right? And we can think about it as fitting into human goals and projects. And it's important to see that the eidetic variation that is going on here implies not only a series of generalizations by which we intellectually represent objects as parts of classes, right? Material object, book, or something like that. But this eidos, this essence, is adequate to the utter particular as an individual of novel experience for us, a unique, originary, given. There's a givenness in our consciousness of it as unique and individual, and that is not the generality, physical thing, or some other essence in that sense. Thinking is intentional, and the fact that we have an intentional structure to our consciousness is an essence that is involved in all of our presentations. And we can modulate our consciousness, we can attune to that aspect, or we can ignore it. And we ignore it in our natural attitude, in our average way of perceiving and having things appear. But it is also possible to modulate and have it become a originary given, something that we in person encounter, this essential relation between consciousness and object, this intentional structure. If we change the content, if we change the date, if we change the moment in existence, all of that, we still have a intentional consciousness, and we still have a temporal consciousness and a originary apprehension. We still have consciousness being given something and being certain that it is conscious of something in that experience. We might not know exactly how this experience connects to another one. We might not be able to connect all of the dots between the facts that we experience, but we have certitude of the essence of thought in its experience of thinking. And this leads Husserl to formulate his principle of all principles in section 24, where he says that the principle of all principles is that each intuition affording in an originary way is a legitimate source of knowledge. That whatever presents itself to us in intuition in an originary way, so to speak, in its actuality in person, is to be taken simply as what it affords itself as, and only within these limitations in which it affords itself there. What he's saying is that we need this absolute beginning, this principium, this principle that we do not question. It is the starting point without which we would not be doing phenomenology, we would not be doing science, we would not be doing any kind of thinking. And what is this? Well, it is that there is an apprehension by consciousness, and he says this original way of intuition affording, sense making, of apprehending. If we can't agree that we apprehend something and that it is given in a way that is true, then we cannot move forward with doing phenomenology. This principle says that phenomenology is possible as a science of essences if we develop this originary bestowal, right? If we use our originary bestowal, our intuition, our conscious apprehension to understand conscious apprehension. The principle is almost tautological. We can apprehend. The consciousness apprehends in an originary givenness. This is rather close to Descartes with the I think in Meditation 2. We have givenness to our consciousness, which is existence. We apprehend that there is existence through our consciousness. Our awareness of existence is given in an originary way. It's an implicit thing that we know through being conscious that what we're experiencing exists and that our consciousness exists. Again, it doesn't mean that the specific content of our experience connected in a certain way, that we have knowledge of that. It only says that we have knowledge of the existence of consciousness and its experience. You know, we would often ask someone about a physical object. If there's an object sitting next to something and someone's standing next to it and we're far away, I'll say, hey, tell me about what you perceive about that. I'm uncertain about it. But I would never say, hey, tell me if I'm actually conscious right now. Look inside my inner experience and tell me if I'm actually experiencing anything. And this is a essence rather than a fact. It is some way in which we are apprehending in general rather than something in particular that we're apprehending.